Good day, everyone. This is a topic on science, technology, and nation building. Here are our lesson intended learning outcomes. We are going to trace the historical development of science and technology in the Philippines across colonial and post-colonial periods. We describe indigenous Philippine scientific and technological practices such as weather prediction, food preservation, and farming. We're going to analyze the role of government science policy in nation development. We are also going to evaluate how science and technology have contributed to the Philippine political, economic, and cultural identity, and we are going to enumerate, and you are going to add also proposed ways science and technology can further support nation building today. So, first, our opening question: can a nation's science and technology policy exist above its politics? Or is science policy always, in some way, an expression of who holds power and what they want the nation to become? So you think about that, and we will come up with an answer later after this discussion. Let's go with the pre-colonial Philippines. And year 900 to 1521, long before Spanish contact, early Filipino communities organized into barangays already possess substantial indigenous science and technology. Filipino seafarers built ocean-worthy boats called the balangay, from which the barangay unit of social organization takes its name. That supported trade across the archipelago and with neighboring Southeast Asian and Chinese traders. Communities used a syllabic writing system, the baybayin, for record keeping and communication, and developed early agricultural engineering, including also the beginnings of the mountainside rice terracing later refined by Cordilleran communities. So we are also going to see this later sa part 6 of this discussion. We are going to talk more about the rice terraces. Also, there are archaeological evidences, including mga gold ornaments and implements such as those recovered from Surigao and Chinese ceramics found at various pre-colonial sites. It indicates that skilled indigenous metallurgy and textile work, alongside established maritime trade routes connecting the islands to a wider regional exchange of goods, culture, and technical knowledge. This period conventionally closes in 1521 with the arrival of Ferdinand Magellan. So the Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, it marks the beginning of sustained contact with Europe. Formal Spanish colonization beginning in 1565 would introduce a very different model of science and technology, one channeled through colonial institutions rather than the indigenous community practice. So let's see. During the Spanish colonial period, 1565 to 1898, Spanish colonial rule formally uh, established under Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, the person here. Um, During 1565, introduced ang European science and technology, largely through the Catholic Church and colonial administration. And of course, also the invention of the printing press. The printing press arrived through uh, Manila and Acapulco trade. Yan. And of course, because of the printing press, it produced religious texts and formal Western style education also developed through the parish schools, and eventually mga universities, including this here, the picture here. This is University of Santo Tomas, founded in 1611 and counted among the oldest universities in Asia. Again, the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade, 1565 to 1815, it connected the colony into a genuinely global trade network spanning sa Asia and also including the Americas. It introduced new crops, goods, and technologies in the process. However, colonial science policy prioritized resource extraction. And of course, ang ilang gid nga main mission here is religious conversion over broad-based scientific development for the general Filipino population. Formal nga science education, it remained largely restricted sa Spanish colonizers and sa mga small local nga elite or what we call the Principalia. While many nga pre-colonial indigenous knowledge systems were displaced and it was discouraged as pagan or simply left undocumented by colonial authorities. Toward the end of this period, mayara na nga mga reformed-minded Filipinos, the Ilustrados, and most notably Jose Rizal, who trained in medical practices specializing in ophthalmology in Europe. Gin-represent niya ang distinctly Filipino engagement with Western science, using scientific and medical training as part sang broader push for national reform. And of course, the end of the Spanish rule in 1898, it is followed by the Philippine-American War, ushered in a new colonial power with a different approach naman to building scientific and educational institutions in the islands. During the American period and the post-Commonwealth era, American colonial administration introduced a public education system on a scale not seen under the Spanish rule. The Pensionado Act of 1903, take note of that, it sent Filipino scholars to study in the United States as a state-sponsored higher education program, while the University of the Philippines, founded in 1908 as the country's first state university, ang naging central institution for Filipino higher learning and research kit. So heavy on research. Government scientific institutions such as ang Bureau of Science, nag-conduct sila sa mga research sa tropical medicine, sa agriculture also, and sa natural resources, and nag-organize sila sa public health initiatives that applied Western medical science directly sa kung ano ang local health condition of the Philippines during that time. So following sang independence in 1946, the Philippines entered the post-Commonwealth era as a sovereign republic, and kakontinue man siya gyapon build on the American era educational and science institutions while also developing its own national science policy infrastructure. This process gin-accelerate significantly ang pag-develop ng scientific institutions in the following decades. So much more dala ta makita nga damo sa mga gin-found or gin-tukod nga mga agencies pertaining to scientific research, technological innovations, and also inventions. Going further into the Marcos era and the martial law, the Philippines' first dedicated national science body, ang NSDB or the National Science Development Board, it was actually created sang 1958 under sa President Carlos P. Garcia before pa sang Marcos era through Republic Act 2067. Ang RA 2067 is the Science Act of 1958. following a national survey of Philippine science and technology conducted by Dr. Frank Tuy. And under sa sang regime ni President Ferdinand Marcos, however, science and technology took a new institutional and constitutional prominence. Sang 1973 Constitution adopted under Marcos Sr., it explicitly declared the advancement of science and technology as state priority for national development. It can be found in 1973 Constitution Article 15, Section 9. Concrete institutional milestones followed. Ang Philippine National Oil Company was created sa 1973 to pursue energy self-sufficiency. Also, may ara man ang NSDB nga research portfolio. It expanded to include bodies such as Philippine Coconut Research Institute. So as you can see here, under siya sa Department of Agriculture, and it is interesting to see the logo that actually gina-showcase agad ang coconut shape. So that's a fun little detail. Also, Philippine Textile Research Institute, which is under the DOST now. So, ang Philippine Textile Research Institute, what else? Philippine Science Community site sa Bikutan, Taguig in 1968. And through Presidential Decree number 1003A, signed on October 6, 1976, the National Academy of Science and Technology, or the NAST, was created to formally honor the country's leading scientists and recommend individuals para sa National Scientists Award. So, dara na nag-start sa Presidential Decree number 1003A. So, let's remember though that it is an important point of critical evaluation, not just recall, that these institutional achievements occurred during martial law, 1972 to 1981. So this is a period of significant human rights violations and suppression of civil liberties under the same administration. Although damo sang let's say wins in the science and tech aspect. And genuine nga science policy institution, kumaga building and authoritarian governance existed side by side under Marcos. Evaluating this era's science policy requires holding both realities at once, rather than treating institutional progress as evidence that the political context was therefore acceptable. Kay damo kita may napasa nga law regarding science and tech. So it does not mean that. And we should evaluate both aspects, holding both reality that this happened at the same time. And of course, hindi man pwede nga dismissing the institutional developments because of the political context. We cannot really say nga acceptable ang political context because have lots of successes with regards sa science and technology development, but we can't also dismiss man ang institutional developments because of the political context. So this tension is directly relevant sa aton nga learning objective number 3. So we analyze the role of government science policy in national development. Yeah, so the restoration sang democratic government sang 1986 would bring another significant reorganization of Philippine science policy, one that remains the basic institutional framework in place today. So let's go with the Fifth Republic. It's actually from 1986 up to the present, following the 1986 EDSA People Power Revolution and the restoration of democratic government under President Corazon Aquino. science policy was formally elevated. Ang Executive Order number 128 signed January 30, 1987 nag-reorganize ang National Science and Technology Authority, which is ang successor sang NSDB kagina during the martial law, into a full cabinet level department, and ang DOST, Department of Science and Technology, it was tasked with providing central direction, leadership, and coordination for the country's scientific and technological development. Subsequent legislation after that strengthened also ang framework of the science and technology policy that was initiated. So for example, sa RA number 8439 sa 1997, the Magna Carta for scientists, engineers, researchers, and other science and technology personnel in government, they are now formally recognized nga science and technology human resources are also essential to national development kag established sang mga scholarships, mga incentives, kag mga benefits to build the country's scientific workforce. Much more recently, sang 2018, may ara sang Balik Scientist Act. So, RA 11305 has been passed, and this is institutionalized gid siya nga program, originally established sang 1975 pa pero gin-reinstate siya in 1993, and finally naisabatas na siya nga naga-encourage sa mga Filipino scientists working abroad to return back home to the Philippines and contribute their expertise to national research instead of working abroad. So, of course, if diri sila ma-contribute sa ila expertise, they are going to broaden or much more ma-improve ang national research and development kag in the fields of DOST, gin-prioritize niya such as biotechnology, information and communications technology, mga disaster mitigation. So those are the things that we need. We need to understand, we need to research more on in order for us to also build a much more stronger national identity in terms of science and technology. So taken together, parts 4 and 5, it show a clear institutional pattern. Philippine science policy evolved from a single advisory board sang 1958, right, toward an increasingly formalized nga legally reinforced nga cabinet-level national science and technology infrastructure. It is a pattern that we will see further down sa ating discussion in parts 7. So let's see. Selected indigenous science and technology of northern Philippines. So we are going to talk about farming practices, weather prediction, and food preservation. So farming practices, the Cordillera region is home to one of the most sophisticated indigenous agricultural engineering achievements in the country. Rice terraces, built and maintained primarily by the Ifugao and other Cordilleran groups including Bontoc, Kalinga, Kankanay, and Ibaloy. Ano ni siya? It carved into a steep mountainside over centuries, and hindi siya ma-maintain kung wala nag-work together ang mga ethnic groups to maintain this rice terraces. So yeah, carved into steep mountainsides over centuries and sustained through complex communal irrigation systems that channel water from mountain forests down through the terraces. This reflects not just agricultural technique but social organization. Nga, maintaining these rice terraces requires coordinated communal labor and water sharing arrangements across the generations. that followed up until today. So the rice terraces of the Philippine Cordilleras were inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1995 in recognition of both their engineering sophistication and their role as a living cultural landscape still maintained by indigenous communities today. Right, that's it. Let's go with weather prediction. Indigenous and rural communities in northern Luzon, including sa Cordillera and adjacent Ilocos provinces, developed detailed traditional weather forecasting systems based on what? Close long-term observation of the natural environment. Unusually, activity among ants kung naglain ang ilang behavior. So, mga unusual activity sang ants, earthworms, what else? Dragonflies, frogs, and particular bird species. They read it as a sign of coming rain or storms. What else? The fruiting and shedding patterns of specific plants, mga cloud formations, and rings around the moon serve as further indicators. So, yeah, ethnographic documentation of Ifugao practices sa work ni Roy Franklin Barton kag ni Harold Cochrane. They are both anthropologists that have studied the Ifugao. So they published books about their research, and more recent agricultural studies conducted in Ilocos Norte have specifically recorded that these indicators are long-standing up until now. They are still practicing this. Ang term ba lang nga, intergenerational. So, they transmit knowledge using word of mouth, probably records also. So, they use it to guide planting schedules and disaster preparedness as well. Developed independently of modern meteorological science and in many communities still consulted alongside today. Last is the food preservation. Indigenous and traditional Filipino food preservation techniques center on methods suited to a humid tropical climate without refrigeration. So, meron kita sang sun drying, meron kita sang smoking of meat and fish, as we can evidently see in tapa and tinapa. Yan. Salting also, and fermentation, as in what we see in bagoong, and fermented preparations such as buro, mga ginaburo, burong isda, burong fruits, yan. These methods reflect practical and empirically refined solutions to the challenge of food security across seasons, developed through generations of localized experimentation rather than formal laboratory science. These three practice areas meet the same functional definition sang science and technology, if you can notice. Introduced sa aton nga first lesson, ano ang functional definition of science and technology? Systematic, tested, intergenerational, verified knowledge applied to solve real environmental and survival problems. So even though they developed entirely outside some formal Western scientific institution, and this directly supports our intended learning outcome number 2. So yeah, with both the formal institutional history of how science and technology developed here in the Philippines and ang indigenous knowledge traditions kung paano gin-establish, we can now examine science policy itself as a distinct object of analysis. What it is, what role it actually plays in national development. Let's go to science policy and national development. Science policy refers to a government's structured commitment expressed through mga law, funding, kag institution building. So, why is it so? It is to direct scientific and technological development toward kung ano ang aton nga national goal. And ang mga institutional arc gintrace ta kagina from NSDP, NSTA, hasta naging DOST na, also reinforced by RA 8439 kag RA 11035. It is a textbook example of science policy in action. Each stage represents a government decision about how much authority, funding, kag legal weight ang ihatag mo sa science and technology as a driver of national development. So, analyzing this role critically, as in our intended learning outcome number 3, means asking not just what institutions were created, but also ano ang purpose that they serve and para kay sino. So you should note that science policy can serve genuine national development while simultaneously serving the political legitimacy needs sang isa ka government that created it. And these are not mutually exclusive, and in a competent analysis, it holds both possibilities open rather than assuming a science policy is automatically neutral or automatically suspect. So as you can see here, ang aton nga science and technology policies, programs, and projects is based on kung ano ang available or kung ano ang ginset nga national goal, ano ang aton nga mga international treaty, ano ang legal frameworks, kag ano ang social needs, issues, and problems. That's how you know that the science and technology policies, programs, and projects are effective. Let's go with science, technology, and Philippine identity. So we have 3: political identity, economic identity, and cultural identity. For the political identity, science policy has functioned as an explicit tool of governance and legitimacy across administrations, from Marcos Sr.'s constitutional and institutional emphasis sa science and technology as part of his broader quote-unquote new society development narrative, no? Hasta sa 1986 nga governments using science policy as part of the democratic nation building agenda. That's science and tech, Philippine identity on the political aspect. How about on the economic aspect? The economic identity. Science and technology has been directly tied to key national economic goals, notably natural nga modernization sang agriculture. Correct? And for example, ang International Rice Research Institute, din na siya ng headquarters siya is sa Los Baños, Laguna since 1960 pa, and it has been central to developing high-yield rice varieties important to both Philippine and global food security. As well as, of course, ang efforts like Balik Scientist Program to draw on mga overseas tanga scientific talents pabalik diri sa Pilipinas for our own domestic development. Lastly, for our cultural identity, it is the recognition and preservation of indigenous knowledge such as we were talking about the rice terraces kanina, and now it has UNESCO World Heritage status na. So alongside formal honors like National Scientist Award, it also reflects how science and technology in both indigenous kag institutional forms have become part of how the Philippines define and takes pride sa iyang own national identity when it comes to science and technology. When it comes to Philippine culture as well. And yes, this directly supports our intended learning outcomes number 4. Let's try to propose how science and technology can further support nation building today. This final section addresses ang aton nga last intended learning outcomes directly. The proposals here are illustrative starting points meant to prompt your own nga thinking kung ano ang imo possible nga gusto i-propose man with regards to science and technology and how they can support nation building. Kung diin kung anong imo stand, kung anong imo nga position. It is not a fixed or exhaustive nga answer key lang. No? So you draw directly on what this lesson has covered already, and then in these 4 examples or 4 proposals, and then you try to also develop your own proposal. So first is integrating indigenous knowledge into formal disaster policy. Of course, you incorporate mga documented traditional weather indicators kay go work. It still makes sense subong sa modern nga understanding of science and technology or weather forecasting. Yan. And also, nakita na kanina sa part 6, but it also as a complementary early warning layer man siya alongside pag-asa's formal meteorological forecasting, particularly in remote communities. 'Di ba? So, yun, weather forecasting. What else? Strengthening return migration science programs. So, we could expand on the balik scientist type nga incentives during our part 5 discussion to further reduce ang mga long-standing nga ginatawag bala nga brain drain of Filipino scientific talents to other countries. Kakaubos ang aton nga scientist or science potential here in the Philippines because they opt to work abroad because better salary. Yan. Well, in fact, if we provide them with reasonable nga salary, they will stay here man. Actually, kaso, kung ari ka sa Pilipinas, they do feel like they are being ang term nga brain drain. So it's not enough. So they need to go abroad and look for more brighter opportunities. So why not, 'di ba? Strengthen the return migration, balik scientist nga mga type incentives. Next, expanding science-based support for smallholder agriculture. So, yun, pwede ka build on the IRRI, ang rice research, or the Green Revolution legacy, pwede man, to extend modern agricultural science and resources para sa mga small-scale farmers nga, of course, Filipino farmers, including those sa indigenous farming communities. Yan. And lastly, protecting and funding indigenous knowledge documentation. Why is documentation important? It's because para may ara kita sang records and that hindi ma-lost ang aton nga mga indigenous knowledge. So, yeah, you protect, you fund ang documentation process. So, treating traditional, ecological, and agricultural knowledge as a national scientific resource worth formal research investment and legal protection as well. Not only cultural heritage item, but actually actively being heritage items of Philippine culture, we should also protect and fund the documentation of each para hindi siya ma-lost in time. So yeah, As you look at all of these, you consider which of these primarily serve economic development, kag diin ang nagaserve sa cultural identity, diin ang nagaserve sa political goals. Yan. And of course, whether a single science and technology policy proposal can or should try to serve all three at once. Dapat, ano man, it would make sense if one proposal could, uh, let's say, matapya gid ang tatlo ka Philippine identity. Yeah. So, yon, if we go back to our opening question, di ba kanina, can a nation's science and technology policy exist above its politics? Or is it always in some way an expression of who holds power and what they want the nation to become? So, if we have understand the discussion, having gone through this lesson, you have seen that the Philippine science policy has never existed in a political vacuum. From Spanish era resource extraction pa lang during that time hasta sa Marcos era nga naga-institution building na siya biskan under martial law hasta subong uh, mga post-democratic reforms. Science and technology policy is never merely a neutral and purely technical lang undertaking. It is always also political in the sense that it reflects the priorities, the values, and power structures of the government that shaped it. So recognizing this doesn't make science policy illegitimate. It makes it something worth evaluating critically, as this lesson has asked you to do. Right? So let's try to further organize our thoughts in a reflection. You're going to choose one era of Philippine science and technology history discussed in this lesson. So whether it's pre-colonial, Spanish, American, Marcos era, or the Fifth Republic, or also one indigenous practice from part 6. Yan, in just 150 or 150 minimum to 250 maximum words, you explain one scientific development or practice from your chosen era or practice, and the political, economic, or cultural condition that most directly shaped it, and lastly, one way it still influences Philippine science, the policy, or identity today. So you submit your reflection, yellow pad, one half crosswise, to your president, and then the president will submit it here sa faculty office. So that is it for this topic on science, technology, and nation building. Thank you very much for listening. Have a great day.